And then the PowerPoint. So gonna blacken it out, I think, at first. We were talking last time about the divide between mainstream liberal Protestantism and evangelicalism. And in the mid 1800s, that divide really didn't exist to the same extent. And it was only after the rise of higher criticism and the acceptance of certain mainstream concepts happening in academia that you have the more liberal wings of Protestantism latching on to ideas that take them farther and farther away from biblical truth. And so initially you have a more conservative Protestant alternative to that was in the minority, like so many other things that happen with these types of trends, these types of cycles. And they begin picking up the pieces in their objections to what's happening in the mainstream. They are not on board with the theory of evolution, with higher criticism of the Bible, with views of morality that begin to become looser in mainstream Protestantism. And you could see that once that fork in the road creates this divide, evangelicals still by and large toe the line at biblical truth, even though on some of these issues, even though that cycle even repeats itself in the evangelical world, and you have today some very liberal evangelicals, and it's just a cycle that keeps going and keeps repeating. But nonetheless, mainstream Protestants continued on that trajectory to the point that modern Presbyterians, Methodists, many Lutherans, the many other mainstream groups don't even resemble their forebears in the late 1800s with regard to conservative respect for biblical authority. I think the Anglican Church has undergone a similar transformation. Even in the mid 20th century, you had some Anglicans that were very conservative. You have a few in the modern world that are still somewhat evangelical, but by and large, the Anglican Church today is very much on board with the liberal social agenda and liberal sexual agenda and all of that. And so the historic differences between us and them over issues like infant baptism and doctrinal points about what the Bible actually teaches become less applicable because we don't even think like they think. They no longer promote the Bible as the absolute authoritative, inerrant Word of God, inspired in the same sense that we look at it. And so consequently, you have this huge divide, and the evangelicals complain about the church being compromised, and even among some of their brethren in the evangelical churches jumping on the bandwagon at various junctures. But again, just be aware that liberal Protestantism doesn't even remotely think like they used to think, or anywhere near where we think. And evangelicals, in the main, have a fairly high regard for biblical authority and biblical scholarship. And modern evangelicals tend to be branched into 4 or 5 major categories. You've got Calvinists in the Reformed churches, and you have a lot of scholarship reflected in those Calvinistic churches. Michael Kruger is an example of someone that has done a lot of good work on the canon and second century Christianity, and highly respected. And there's a lot of good scholarship coming out of Calvinistic seminaries and schools of higher learning. Don't agree with their Calvinistic theology, but they at least hold to a biblical pattern. John MacArthur's viewpoints are Calvinistic, and he does a lot of preaching that I would agree with, does a certain amount of preaching that I totally disagree with, but it's certainly, at least in many points, based on a biblical standard, even though I think it's a skewed biblical standard. And so you got that wing of modern evangelicalism. You've got some Calvinists and a lot of non-Calvinists that will lean in a premillennial position, and a lot of Reformed Calvinists that really are not premillennials at all. And so that's a major difference in points. You have some Baptists that are Calvinistic, some that are kind of in the middle of the road, and some that are more free will, and some Baptists that tend to be, in fact, quite a few that tend to be wholly on board with the dispensational premillennial agenda, whereas a few that totally disagree with that. You have some conservative Lutherans, Presbyterians, and others that tend to be evangelical, but in the main, you have a lot of ultra-liberal versions of representatives of those denominations. Hardly any Anglicans are ultra-conservative anymore. John Stott was somewhat evangelical before he died, and you can make a case that N.T. Wright might be sometimes hugging the evangelical borders of things, but really not super conservative. So you've got that. But what you really have in the development in the evangelical world in the last several decades is the rise of Pentecostalism. And at least half of all evangelicals, if not more than half these days, are definitely have Pentecostal leanings. And so, ironically, the whole Pentecostal movement as we know it began in 1906. It was unknown prior to the 20th century. You do have various movements in men, including some go all the way back to the second century, late second century. We talked about Montanus, and I had a couple of female prophetesses, and they were rejected as not being apostolic and being kind of a latter-day prophecy, latter-day Pentecostal type view, and they were rejected by the main players in the early church of the time. But modern Pentecostalism is unknown prior to the 20th century. Again, there have been outbreaks of emotional tendencies and Holy Spirit tendencies, but modern Pentecostalism has its roots in the holiness movement of the Methodists, 19th century, and really broke out in an Azusa Street rival in Los Angeles by William Seymour in April 1906. Ed Harrell has written a lot about this. He wrote a book about Oral Roberts. He was one of the experts among late 20th century historians on modern Pentecostalism, probably the go-to guy if there was any historian that knew more about them than anyone else. And the Los Angeles Times reported in April of 1906, weird babble of tongues, new sect of fanatics is breaking loose. Wild scene last night on Azusa Street. Gurgle of wordless talk by a sister. And what seemed to be bizarre, out of the mainstream initially, then becomes mainstream. That lasted 3 years, by the way. Christians from North America, Europe, and third world countries attended, and the fires of Pentecostalism spread rapidly. And then at this point, close to 50% of nominal Christians are Pentecostal. I would say well over half of those who consider themselves evangelical definitely have Pentecostal leanings, and many of those in mega churches are at least open to Pentecostal ideas. It's the fastest growing Christian movement today. And I remember in the late 20th century, before the turn of the millennium, Ed Harold was saying that by the time we get into the early 21st century, that again, the vast majority of those who call themselves Christians will have Pentecostal leanings. And I think that has played out just as he predicted. So that's a wrinkle that has to be dealt with more and more, unfortunately. And Pentecostals place a special emphasis on the direct personal experience of God through the baptism of the Holy Spirit, usually associated with speaking in tongues. So that's an issue that won't go away. You'll have to deal with it. You'll have to deal with it in Acts 2 and 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Corinthians 13, other places, and become somewhat expert in dealing with that issue, because a lot of people that learn anything about Christianity are going to be impacted by those who are influenced by this movement. Most believe in human free will, which is counter to Calvinism. So you've got the Reformed wing, which generally is non-Pentecostal. And even someone like John MacArthur says some very choice things about the Pentecostals. But ironically, Billy Graham was kind of open to embracing them, but he was also one that wanted people of every stripe at his crusades. So he spoke in glowing terms of people who were Pentecostal, even though he himself was not. But he was one of those that kept more of an open mind than a lot of Baptists would like. So you have Pentecostal denominations: Assemblies of God, Church of God in Christ, United Pentecostal Church, and others that have embraced various aspects of Pentecostalism, including a lot of these mega churches that don't nominally either belong to a denomination or at least overtly belong to a denomination. I mean, there are the Lakewood Church in, what is it, Houston, Texas, certainly started with Pentecostal roots, has gotten away from them. They don't wear those on their sleeves necessarily, but they're definitely Pentecostal in orientation. Joel Osteen, but Oral Roberts, Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Kenneth Copeland, a lot of old guys here that are dead or were very active in the second half of the 20th century. Joel Osteen still active, but ironically, again, Ed Harold told me this privately. He said that Joel Osteen and his father at one point were extremely Pentecostal conservative, believed that, you know, women should not wear makeup. They preached the party line and did very Pentecostal things. But they made a conscious decision at some point, Joel in particular, to get away from some of those antics and to really get away from holding a lot of biblical truth on anything because of widening the umbrella of who would be in their tent. And so they got away from really preaching a strong, biblically driven, Pentecostal message, or even a traditional Pentecostal message, because of widening that machine that his church is at this point. Ernest Angley, Pat Robertson, a lot of other names that were prominent in the 20th century. But the megachurch movement is another wrinkle that is relatively recent in terms of the last several decades. And I have an article in my files called The Experience-Driven Church. And I believe in a biblical authority-driven church rather than an experience-driven church. But mega churches generally are very experience-driven. They're trying to create an atmosphere, a medley of offerings that present a certain experience to the consumer. And they're also called new paradigm churches, seeker-sensitive churches, shopping mall churches, at least in the last few decades. Those were some of the names used. Most tend to be evangelical or Pentecostal. More than half are allegedly non-denominational. Some of those keep their denominational ties and just don't advertise them. Others do away with the denominational ties altogether. and 1 in 5 are Baptist. The Atlantic Monthly, about 27 years ago, said no spires, no crosses, no robes, no clerical collars, no hard pews, no kneelers, no biblical gobbledygook, no prayerly rote, no fire, no brimstone, no pipe organs, no dreary 18th century hymns, no forced solemnity, no Sunday finery, no collection plates. Going to a very different environment with a very different look, very modern with dramatic productions, cappuccino carts, food courts, aerobic classes, children's programs, contemporary music, soft preaching. I would say those last two, contemporary music and soft preaching, are hallmarks of almost every mega church out there. Not all, but most. Kenton Beshore, Mariner South Coast Church, Orange County, said we give them what they want and we give them what they didn't know they wanted, a life change. And over the years, late 20th century, you had Robert Schuller's Crystal Cathedral, which is now owned by the Catholics. City Harvest Church, Lakewood Church, many other examples. Mega church movement. This verse comes to mind. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires. When you go door to door and ask people what they want in a church, then you're going to tend to give them what they want rather than what they need. And Jesus was all about not my will, but yours be done. And the typical megachurch is very consumer conscious and consumer driven. And compromise is inevitable. I don't know how you get around it if drawing a big crowd and studying church growth patterns and pressing all the right buttons of the consumer in order to get a response and build a following, if it replaces preaching biblical truth. And again, there are a lot of passages that we could give that come to mind. You know them. But questions, and one of the verses that is used of Jesus and the Sadducees, they know neither the scriptures nor the power of God, is applicable to modern liberal Protestants. They do not know the scriptures, nor do they know the power of God. And so what Jesus says in summarizing the problem with the Sadducees, I think the modern liberal Protestants are the modern Sadducees, the modern counterpart. They've taken much less of a stand for anything countercultural, very much creatures of the culture, and have tended to shrink numerically in recent decades. We can talk long and hard why that might be so. But if you don't have anything unique to offer the culture, if you become embroiled in the culture, then there's nothing there unique to offer people who see a problem with the culture. And therefore, numerical decline is almost inevitable. What does an error-filled human production Bible say about the liberal Protestants' God? Not very high, not very much. You know, it raises questions about how big is your God, and it also tells us why infant baptism and related topics are no longer the major issues between these types of folks, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, and us. Sharp differences among evangelicals, such as Calvinist versus Pentecostal, but not as many lines are currently drawn along strictly denominational lines. Yet there are still common doctrinal errors in evangelical circles. Not going away anytime soon are the errors of salvation by faith alone, once saved, always saved, church structure and organization, instrumental music, many others. So if you think that you can get away from these topics, think again. They're going to be there as long as you're preaching. And then finally, evangelical megachurches tend to be experience-driven and consumer-oriented rather than biblically authority-driven. And I don't have to ask you what the problem is with using the quality of the experience as the primary benchmark for choosing a church. 2 Timothy 4, many other passages come to mind. Okay, so questions or comments on any of that before we switch gears here?
Yeah. When you say that a lot of evangelical churches are like sympathetic to Pentecostalism, uh, are there like, how do you see that? What are a couple of ways in which that shows up?
I think I made the statement that a lot of mega churches are, but a lot of evangelicals are. I mean, if over half of evangelicals are Pentecostal overtly, or at least on board with experience-driven emotionalism under the name of the Spirit, even when churches are not overtly Pentecostal, there's a lot of fudging that goes on about how the Spirit leads us, for example. And that gets away from objective standards in the revealed word versus subjective emotions. But in truth, if Ed Harrell is right on his numbers, and I think that's totally right at this point, that over half of evangelicals are overtly Pentecostal, then you've got when the Saddleback Church got going in Orange County, California in the 1980s and 90s, and Rick Warren was the senior pastor for years there, and they kind of opened a door to multiple views on some things. When the Calvary Chapel started in Costa Mesa, which is Orange County also, and I preached in Orange County 16 years, so I'm aware of these things. You had in their statement of faith, it basically, and I'll present this next week actually, that we are not a denominational church per se, but we're opposed to those things that bring division among people of different denominational backgrounds, and believe that, you know, we basically need to agree to disagree. And so you have in Calvary Chapel, generally not Pentecostal, but you have a spectrum there that's open to people that lean that direction. And you might have other movements. Vineyard Christian Fellowship might tend to be more Pentecostal than some of the other movements are, but you definitely have some churches that are in the middle and are not overtly Pentecostal, but very open to Spirit generated activities that play into Pentecostal's hands. And I think that's especially true in the megachurch movement. So Joel Osteen's church is no longer as overtly Pentecostal as it once was, but they're still very much Pentecostal and very open to those ideas. And that's, I think, fairly typical. I mean, if others have a different take on that, you can speak now and interject your view on that. But I think that Southern Baptists tend not to be Pentecostal, but I've even run into some that are open to some things. So um, I don't know that that answers your question, but um, if you run into someone who really claims to be evangelical, there's at least half a chance he's Pentecostal.
Yeah, you mentioned, Mike, that, and I agree with what you said, that we tend Christians tend to give what people want rather than what people need. And somehow I've seen this a lot in uh, Pentecostals and in with the evangelicals. And you mentioned about the Saddleback Church, and I've heard Rick Warren did this before. That he did a survey actually. He did the survey on what the congregation, what the members would like them to do or to add into their worship to make it more vibrant, to make it more appealing. So the church members gave their what they want, and true enough, what they want actually what was given to them by the Saddleback Church, by Rick Warren. So yeah, we tend to, and again I agree, we tend to give what people want rather than what they need. And what I like about most of the Lord's Church is that we tend to give what they need rather than what they really want, because we stick to the principle of the Bible. So just my thought on what you said a while ago.
Yeah, I can remember reading a few years ago in Christian Chronicle, there were some representatives of Churches of Christ that hired this church growth expert that worked a lot with mega churches about what changes could be made in these Churches of Christ in order to be more attuned to church growth. And he said, your a cappella singing is going to be a huge challenge. So when you are used to creating club quality music that has the full regalia of the band or whatever, um, and you're not giving people that, then again, your underlying core motivation is going to be completely different. And are you trying to create the experience that people want to see, or are you trying to obey the plan of God? And those are two totally different motivations. Unfortunately, there are a lot more Churches of Christ these days that are bending even on that issue, or churches that call themselves Churches of Christ. Okay, I have two more PowerPoints, and one, I'll just tell you, if you want to be part of next week's the last session, and then we're done. Reagan, Caleb, and I are going to do something different next quarter, just with ourselves, and we're open to having a once a month or once every couple of months preacher's breakfast or preacher's lunch or something like that, if you're open to it. But we're going to do our own little thing, not online. And if you're interested, we can announce that too. But it'll be our own little powwow. But next week I have a one-shot PowerPoint for all of church history that ends up with the idea of getting back to the biblical blueprint. And I hit the highlights of church history over the last 2,000 years. And then in light of that, show people the value of getting back to the apostolic blueprint. And so if you're interested in that, I could send you the PowerPoint, or we'll do that next week if you're interested in tuning in. And I have one more PowerPoint today, and that is challenges of the culture. And so let me bring that PowerPoint up, and Hold on with me here, just a second. So I need to share the PowerPoint. And I've called this the rise of secular worldviews. And so not only do we contend with where the so-called religious world is going, but we have to contend with the larger culture. And in terms of where that is now, none of this will be new and revolutionary to any of you, but if I were to teach this to a church class, we would be reading passages like Genesis 1, where God creates man and what is involved in that, and the worth and value of a human being, and impacted by the knowledge of a creator God, and loving him because he's first loved us, and all of that. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the whole postmodern thing has taken on a new dimension, and the Judeo-Christian biblical heritage has completely lost its grip on Western civilization. Happened earlier in Europe, but it's really taken root here in the United States of America. Now, I know a couple of you are from Alabama and Reagan from Kentucky, and even there you see vestiges of this, but you really see it out here in California, and I think in the nation as a whole. Other worldviews have largely replaced the Judeo-Christian heritage, secular humanism, postmodernism, New Age versions of spirituality, and more recently, in recent years, I think the number one secular threat is a kind of a Marxist ideology mixed with race, gender ideologies, and global technocracy. And I don't believe that'll abate anytime soon. In fact, I think that last category that lumps a lot of different things together will take on kind of a quasi-religious devotion in the society at large. And although it will not be recognized as a traditional religious impulse, it nonetheless involves many religious components. And it's like people have historical amnesia. And I think it was Hegel that said the only thing we never learn from history is that we never learn from history, or the only thing we learn from history is we never learn from history. And people have forgotten Christianity's influence on Western culture. Most of the major advancements in personal freedom, human rights, democratic ideals, and notions of equality were highly influenced by believers in the Bible. And this is one of the reasons I put Genesis 1, 26 through 28, Psalm 8, other passages there on the outset. Were biblical truths perfectly applied to their world? No, but even with imperfections, Christian influenced societies radically outperformed non-Christian societies in generally and eventually creating far better opportunities. You had far more equality of opportunity, far more rights of the individual, far more women's rights, far more respect of individual freedoms. But what happens when people turn their back on the very biblical principles that led to these things? I think that's where we are, and we're in grave danger as a society. When the biblical worldview is abandoned, what are the implications for the open pursuit of truth? What are the implications for a firm basis in right and wrong? What are the implications for respecting the dignity, value, and rights of every individual in society? What are the implications for religious freedom? What are the implications for the freedom of speech and the censorship of modern technocracy? I believe that as we continue to turn our backs on God and the biblical principles that built Western civilization, the more we will see an erosion and deterioration of the very rights that got us to this point to begin with. And we're already seeing it. So the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, so that those rights come from the creator, not the government, or not some powerful entity that grants them to us. They come from God. And among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, or the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All of those things are in jeopardy right now, every single one of them. And I believe they're in jeopardy because we have turned our back on the very principles on which this nation was built. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. We see deterioration of that going on more and more in our society right now. So what if biblical principles are abandoned as a basis of law and society? What might the prevailing rules of society look like as a replacement? How would or should Christians function in such a society? Well, we're going to have to, one way or another. And we still must be the salt of the earth, the light of the world. But in a world of competing ideologies, when larger worldviews are replacing the Judeo-Christian one, regardless of prevailing worldviews, we can promote the gospel, we can live the gospel as best we can. I do recommend a book. I had Reagan and Caleb read it. It's called Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher. And he believes we're in a period of time that is very similar to what happened in Eastern Europe after World War II, when the communist bloc deprived a lot of the Eastern European nations of their freedoms. And we're in a very similar period of history. And people who lived back in that period in those countries, almost to a person, will tell you that this period reminds them of that one. Another book that is probably worth reading is Eric Metaxas on Bonhoeffer, because he believes that the 1930s Germany and the erosion of individual liberties in that decade under Hitler is very similar to what we're experiencing right now. We don't always see it. We don't always recognize it, but I think reading both of those books will be eye-opening to you. Persecution, I think, will likely come in greater measure in the next few years. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I do believe we will be increasingly targeted. That won't necessarily be a bad thing, but I think we need to brace people for the inevitable. But we also have to remember one thing, and that is when it is darkest, we can see the stars, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said. And the worse that conditions deteriorate, the brighter the gospel light we can shine in our words, deeds, and message to the world around us. I don't know about you, I seem to be running into more people that are very frustrated with the world around us right now. And I know that part of our evangelistic efforts are as successful as they are right now because people are really frustrated with the larger society. So again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. but it's just something to be aware of, that what we have to offer people is infinitely more valuable the darker the world becomes. And they're able to see the light even more so because of where society is going. And so I think in the next few years, there will be major challenges, but I also think those challenges will bring opportunities with them. And so again, I went through that PowerPoint really quickly, but what do you all think about that? Are you running into people that are frustrated right now? And we certainly are. I had a call this morning from a Chinese woman that she just frustrated how corrupt she sees society and how things are, and is beside herself. And so we're getting more and more of those people. Appreciate the good work you did on the meeting recently, because I think that addressed a lot of the issues that people in this kind of an environment are asking. And you know, Nick capped it off that Sunday night with a good lesson on who Jesus is. There is major curiosity about Jesus going on in the Silicon Valley right here, right now. And we've got to capitalize on that, I think. So I just am a big believer in taking advantage of your opportunity. So any questions or comments?
Yeah, just a question, Mike. What's your thought about where do you think the Lord's Church is going in the next couple of years with what's happening around now?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that last week. And I talked a little bit more about it privately with Reagan and Caleb. I think there are going to be some major opportunities, but I also think there are going to be some major challenges. What generally happens in this stage of the cycle is major growth. But what the headwinds that we run into in this particular cycle are secular forces that are aligned with popular culture, that are doing everything they can to beat the faith out of young people as they go off to university, to discredit the Bible, to discredit the value system of the Bible. And if you're going to function in a Fortune 500 company and be given a steady diet by the human resources department, that in social equity, justice, and gender ideology, and you're going to fit in to the popular culture, then you're going to question biblical value system. And we have to counter that. And we have to give a message that runs counter to that people will be willing to hear. And so I think there's some major headwinds. And as I kind of survey the canvas across the nation, for example, I see a lot of churches in trouble. We're trying to do some preacher training, and I don't see hundreds of young men standing in line to learn how to do it. Reagan told me the other day that his graduating class for biblical studies at Florida College a couple of years ago, 6 men, 6 in biblical studies. And so how many young preachers are out there? How many young men are being groomed by their parents to preach the gospel? How many churches do you know of in major trouble versus churches that you know of that are really prospering? And again, you get outside the Bible Belt and even in the Bible Belt, there are churches that are prospering, but are in more trouble than what the surface appearance might suggest because of all the bombardment of popular culture and compromise with the value system of popular culture. That's my opinion. Does someone have a different one? I think we are at an inflection point where I see the Lord's church taking off in some other cultures, in third world countries, in Africa, parts of China, parts of India, parts of other cultures. And I see it being more prosperous there than it is here. I think the entire biblical foundation of things is in major trouble in Western civilization. And we can counteract that, and we've got the truth. And we need to rescue individuals and capitalize on our opportunities, but we are going to be outmanned, outgunned, and have to depend on God like never before. Anybody have a take on that?
You think, Mike, that I mean, our silence as part of the Lord's church is one of the hurdles in church growth and in the following years? Because um, just my opinion and my observation, there are so many other groups out there that are, like, for example, the LGBTQ plus. I don't know how many plus there is right now, but they are more, very much vocal about their ideologies. And it's like our silence is sort of killing us, sort of.
I'm
the
going to give you
problem.
one example of that, and some of you will not agree with this, okay? But I'm going to give you a very concrete example. When the whole COVID thing hit, you had messaging from the County of Santa Clara Health Department and the State of California Health Department essentially saying that essential businesses can stay open, and that would include marijuana dispensaries, liquor stores, abortion clinics, Hollywood studios, the whole sin industry. And big box stores were included, and churches were not. In fact, churches were targeted for closure for a large percentage of 3 years. And I don't believe personally, and I'm expressing a personal opinion, okay? I don't believe that Churches of Christ handled that situation the best way that we could have. And you may disagree with some of the stances that John MacArthur, his church took. And I disagree with his Calvinism and his views on baptism and a whole lot of other things that he teaches. But they recently put out a video called The Essential Church. I highly recommend that you get this video. If you want a copy, I have an extra copy. It cost me about $10 a piece, and it's on DVD. And it will go through their thought process over the 3-year period. They lost people initially. They lost some of their main people, but in the end, they gained people. And they gained a whole lot more people than they lost because they took a stand. And their stand was, the church is the most essential institution besides the home in the entire state. And if we don't stand up for this, when these same politicians who are out with rioters without masks on or whatever, and telling us that we can't even assemble as a church or sing or have home Bible studies or congregate in groups more than 50, or do any of these things over this period of many months into years, then if we don't stand for this principle, then how can we possibly justify our existence before God and before other people? And it's an interesting video because you may or may not agree with some of their thought process, but they will walk you through why the church was essential. And I believe that we did not do as well as they did in standing for that principle. And that's one example of many that I would say, yeah, but I totally agree with you. If righteous and godly people don't stand up for the truth of God, and we complain about where society is going, then we have only ourselves to blame. And individually and collectively, I think we have not done as well as we could have. And I'll include myself. I have not done the job that I need to do as a Christian and as a preacher. And I hope that we can all commit ourselves to doing better. But I would urge you to listen to that video. It's eye-opening. All right, any last comments or thoughts? Okay, appreciate it. If you want to tune in next week, it's kind of an optional thing that just takes you through all of church history in one lesson and ends up with the desire to get back to the biblical blueprint. And you may have a sermon like that, but it's my version of church history in one shot. And so that's next week, and then we're done. And appreciate all of you being a part of this. And if you want to do the preacher's lunch, preacher's breakfast thing, let's do it, once a month or once every couple of months, and on into January in following. So take care. Have a good rest of your day. Have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mike.